Hello and welcome back to another YouTube video. Today I'm doing my 14.17 mid-lane tier list, so if you enjoy the content, like, subscribe, and let's get into it. There were a couple of changes this patch. Obviously we saw more continuous system nerfs towards the marksman, fleet getting nerfed, absorbed life getting nerfed, cut down getting nerfed. All these were directly targeted towards marksman, taking over mid lane in competitive and elite play. Marksmen in the mid lane have been weak for the average player for a while now. It's still something I'm going to heavily recommend avoiding, and then playing other champions which can either answer them if they're still popping up, but their popularity's kind of died down at this point. Of course, we also saw direct buffs to the likes of Lissandra, Twisted Fate, and Rise. Then we saw some nerfs to the likes of Silas, Aurora, Katarina, and Ezreal. It still sees a bit of play with the mid lane, so that is something to cover. But yeah, the detail. To go with Corki, still something I'd recommend avoiding. It does still seem to have a presence within competitive at the moment. This obviously isn't really reflective of the changes at the moment. A lot of the changes aren't actually on the live competitive patch, as they are playing 2 patches behind. I believe they're playing on 14.15, so the fleet nerfs haven't gone through, neither the absorb life nerfs or the cutdown nerfs. But by Worlds, I imagine ADCs are just completely gone out of the mid lane. Corki, I'd heavily recommend avoiding this champion. Alongside Corki, we've got all the other marksmen which are really underperforming at the moment in the mid lane. So we have Varus, who got buffed this patch for lethality variants. You can honestly play lethality Varus in the mid lane to a degree of success. Not so much the on-hit variations, they don't seem to be as performant, and AP Varus has basically completely died out. We've obviously seen some like Locket variations which are situationally viable, but not something I'd really recommend defaulting on. And yeah, the champion still underperforms here. The other champions, obviously, Lucian, Caitlyn, we've got Tristana, Zeri. All these champions have either been directly nerfed or they have been hit by the system nerfs. Joining them down is going to be Smolder, who obviously now has swapped to Grasp, but still performs a lot worse. He's actually gaining traction in high elo and competitive at the moment as the next big thing, the next marksman people are picking up. However, I wouldn't be surprised if in 14.18 we see him get nerfed, maybe some early game nerfs, and then trying to amp up his late game, so he's not so strong within laning phase, where they have shifted a decent amount of power to him in more recent patches. Well, recent patches being like most of the last split into this split. The C tier is going to consist of relatively similar champions. We have Kai'Sa towards the trail end. She does have the AP variations which can function as like a harass long range artillery mage. It's still pretty underperformant compared to a lot of picks and requires good setup and oftentimes a decent amount of gold to really get going. Azir is actually going to be with my D tier. He should actually be at the top of my D tier. He's still someone I'd recommend avoiding. Even though he got buffed more recently, he's still very much underperformance for the average player, and that I don't believe is going to change anytime soon unless they do a big kit reshape for him. Kassadin has been underperforming for a while. Ever since they nerfed him going into the split, he's been really struggling, so he also remains within my C tier. Kiana, very elite skewed AD assassin. The higher up you go, the more performant this champion is. So, like, she is basically S tier, I believe, when you start getting into like the Grandmaster Challenger zones. But for average tier, which is what these tier lists are targeted towards, which is like Diamond to like Gold, yeah, she's still underperformed, so something I'd recommend avoiding. Zoe, very dominant in China. Doesn't really have that same level of performance in the Western regions, but being obviously Americas and Europe. This champion is something I'd recommend avoiding unless you're very confident in your ability to snowball, but she can function quite well. Obviously, very reliant on gold, not so reliant on XP, and Zoe support can function quite well, especially with the likes of MF within the meta. Orianna and Jace wrap up my C tier for what remains. In Jace's case, he just hasn't really found traction with this split. He does tend to do a bit more, do a bit better within the mid lane with like electrocute variations, where you play very much around one shot and less about your harass, even though you still obviously lean into that when you can. In Orianna's case, she's been doing a bit better with the 5% AP ratio buff on her Q, but it's still not really enough to really push her up into a higher tiers. Wouldn't surprise me if she might see like a buff going into 14.18 if they do want to see her within competitive, she does still see some play. Like, they might just be fine with her seeing like as like a fringe pick, but not doing as well as some of the other options. Katarina, unfortunately, drops back down again. She's basically back to where she was. I know a lot of Katarina players are very frustrated about the place where this champion is at the moment, and I mean, to a degree, I to a degree agree with their frustration, as this champion's kind of just been messed around over the last couple of patches. It would be nice to see like Riot listen to some of the feedback. I know a lot of Katarina players want like the on hit taken off and then like primarily just amp up her AP ratio so she's not as tied to certain items. But it'll be interesting to see where they move this champion in the long run. She does have some more build variations at the moment. We've seen some like Dark Harvest, Summonary, Leandry, Harass variations, but I know a lot of people just aren't happy with the place she's in at the moment, and yeah, she drops back down to the C tier. Obviously performs better if you're one trick on the champion. It's just something I wouldn't really recommend getting into at the moment, especially after the nerfs. Other champions, actually, moving straight up. Oh no, we got one other champion here. We got Yasuo. So Yasuo drops down from my B tier into my C tier. This champion lost it a lot with the fleet nerfs. He was someone who obviously uses it as his primary keystone. Conqueror just isn't as performant. Same goes for Yone. Yone, fortunately, wasn't the tier above. Yone was like an A tier pick, in my opinion, and he will drop down to B tier. But Yasuo, B tier, down to the C tier. Yasuo is arguably harder to pilot than Yone, and is more early game skewed than Yone in a lot of situations. So he does drop down to the C tier here. Moving on to the B tier, we have Akali. He's just doing worse with the more recent changes he received. That was the ult change and the E change. Yeah, she drops down the tier list towards the bottom of the B tier at the moment. Akshan in a really rough spot at the moment. It's kind of unfortunate because I know there are a lot of Akshan OTPs, and this pick has definitely paid for the sins of a lot of the other marksmen as of recent. His itemization's weaker, his runes are weaker, and yeah, you can feel it. Obviously, Akshan is very much just a solo queue bound champion. We don't really see him competitive outside of like previously where we saw him in some top lane games, played as a top laner in some games. But yeah, for the moment, he's in a pretty rough spot, and I would recommend avoiding him. But obviously, if you're an OTP, then this is what you're going to play, so it doesn't really matter at that point. Malphite is going to move on my B tier. I primarily utilize this pick as like an answer into AD comps when mid has been shown that if you pick him blind and Silas is open, you will just get counterpicked, and into AP matchups you are still going to struggle. You of course do have like AP variations which you can opt into, but AP Malphite tends to be a bit more inconsistent and a bit more reliant on just snowballing. In most scenarios, yeah, just play him as like an answer to a lot of things, and you should find a decent amount of success. His ease of play obviously does benefit him here, but I've kind of gone off Malphite as of recent. His agency tends to be pretty low compared to some of the options you can play, thus not really something I'd really recommend for climbing consistently. Zed, pretty hard to pilot pick. Obviously, once you get over that curve, he can definitely find a decent amount of success looking for those like long range harass and like entry combos where you're like dropping your ult and then like using W to amp up like as many shurikens as you can into your ult damage. It can be quite valuable, and there's loads of different ways you can play this champion, whether that's just looking for picks or using his range with W to just harass people out. There's different variations here, but for the moment he's going to be within my B tier, as he's a bit harder to pilot than some of the other picks. Twisted Fate moves up to my A tier, so I'll talk about him in a second. Actually, no, I'll talk about him now. Twisted Fate surprised me on a serious patch. I did not think the 20 damage bonus on his Q would be enough to really push him up a tier, but he actually quite aggressivly jumps up to A tier. Obviously, Q max is only really played with AP. You tend to not even opt into points when playing AD Twisted Fate. You tend to just leave Q with no points. But yeah, for AP Twisted Fate, it's done wonders. Obviously, AP Twisted Fate tends to lean towards like a Roa, Lichbane, RFC build variation, spikes pretty heavily within the mid game. And yeah, he benefited from it. So Twisted Fate jumps up to my A tier now. Moving on with the B tier picks, I have Cho'Gath, who is like a high B tier pick. This champion has definitely been really aggressively buffed more recently. Like just as like a stat stick champion, I say this all the time, but yeah, like his E having a max damage of 100 once you have like all 5 points into it is incredibly aggressive compared to what it's been in the past. Like Cho'Gath's damage just as a champion has been really aggressively bumped up and up. Like his Q now has like a 340 or 320 damage at max rank as well, which is absurd compared to where it has been in the past. And yeah, Cho'Gath definitely benefiting from these buffs. It now has him as like a high B tier pick. AP Cho'Gath just isn't anywhere near as successful as it has been in the past with like Everfrost variations, but it's something you can kind of opt into with like Rocket Belt in certain positions. But if you just want to play standard Cho'Gath, that is the way I'd recommend him. Like, you can go Comet, you can go Hail Up Blades, you can go Grasp. There's different variations there, and yeah, you should have a decent amount of success. He is a solid high B tier pick. Ziggs, not finding as much success in the mid lane at the moment. He tends to be pretty common within the bot lane though. However, obviously APA, if you want to watch someone play Ziggs mid, that is who I'd recommend as a go-to. He is obviously very successful on the pick, and there is definitely that high skill ceiling where if you're consistently landing Qs, you're playing the map correctly, then this champion can be really successful. Wouldn't really recommend it as much for average play. It actually tends to be a champion which requires a decent amount of time sunk into it. If you're looking for something maybe a bit more easy to pick up, arguably, than something like Xerath, I would really recommend. I think Xerath's in a really good spot in his current state. It's good itemization and things like that. But yeah, Ziggs kind of sits towards the bottom of my B tier at the moment. Ahri is getting buffed in 14.18, and they are aggressive buffs. So if you want to put time into playing Ahri, now is it. But she is still in a pretty lackluster spot. Obviously, the nerfs towards Lich Bane and Storm Surge, which were items she could opt into previously, did hurt her. She does have like Malignance variations, which obviously play around her ultimate, and giving that shorter CD combined with the damage on that can be quite valuable. But the buffs in 40.18 towards her E, very aggressive, should definitely benefit her, especially some of her heavy AP builds and less of her utility focused builds. But yeah, Ahri sits in like the mid to high B tier section at the moment. Talon, not really doing as well as I'd hope he would. He's obviously a pretty hard to pilot assassin pick. If you're nailing the combos down, like the Q fade away, where you Q a minion and then you can like flash redirect it, or there are like different variations you can pull off with it. It's always interesting to like watch Talon OTPs play, and if you're very if you very much want to play Talon, watch the OTPs play it. You can learn a lot of tips and like how to make sure you're landing both sides of W, making sure you're getting the Q and executing the combos as quickly as possible. There's definitely a lot of intricacies there, but yeah, he kind of sits within my B tier for the moment. But if you put a lot of time in, you can definitely be rewarded on a pick like this. Fizz, underperforming. This champion's definitely had his heyday with like the Lich Bane Storm Surge, but with Storm Surge being buffed in 40.18, could definitely see Fizz rise back up. Obviously, Aso is a very good matchup for Fizz. He can punish it quite aggressively and definitely benefit from some of the other more heavily artillery-based champions within the mid lane. Lissandra moves up. Aurelia stays within my B tier, so Aurelia definitely took a bit of a hit with the bulk changes in 14.15, I believe. Has kind of dropped down slightly because of them, on top of like obviously some direct changes towards her to try and encourage her to being played a bit more in elite. She's dropped down a bit, now sits towards the mid B tier for me. Other champions which dropped down, so we're gonna have I'm going to leave LeBlanc in A tier. She did get nerfed this patch, and they did do a bit to like attack her, but she drops from like a high A tier to like a low A tier. Obviously, she was very overpowered in elite play, so the nerfs were warranted. But yeah, she drops from like a high A to a low A tier pick. I think the only other champion I'm going to drop down for the moment is going to be Yone, who obviously got tagged by the fleet nerfs this patch, so a B tier, a bit more shrunk. A lot of champions have moved up, as I believe they are performing a bit better. Actually, Ryze, I was going to have Ryze in A because I think this champion's quite underrated, but yeah, he's also a high B tier pick in my opinion at the moment. This champion obviously got buffed this patch, really benefited from that. 5 more damage on Q as his main spell is very valuable. That combined with having his R having more uptime is obviously going to be a bit more elite skewed, where they can utilize that ability a bit better, but still just generalistically helps him. Ryze was kind of underrated to a degree as well, so yeah, I'm going to have him in the high B tier. But you can definitely perform quite well on him, and he can rise up towards like a high A tier option. Yeah, moving on to the A tier then. So we have Neeko, who is pretty much a forgotten mid laner at the moment. She's like the least popular pure mid laner, I believe, in her current state. Actually, I might take that spot. I can't remember off the top of my head. But yeah, Neeko, we've gone back to being really unpopular. Still in a pretty good spot though. Like the protobelt changes did help her. Storm Surge being buffed in 14.18 will also help her quite a bit. So there's definitely going to be room for Nico to grow within the next couple of patches. That combined with some of the other champions being nerfed, she can definitely find a place within the meta at the moment, but she's still very unpopular. Kind of sits as like a low A tier option, but you can, as always, find a decent amount of success on a pick like this. Morgana, I could drop down to the B tier, and I probably should. This champion just relies a bit too much on setup and a bit too much on people just not really understanding where her damage comes from. Because, like, if you're playing her mid lane, a lot of that damage comes from her W. Like, making sure you can consistently, like, tag people with it, combined with the wave, getting shove, and then utilizing your ability to shove to roam to sides and get advantages. Your Black Shield can be powerful in situations, but not the reason why you just want to purely play this pick, because you do need to get value out of this champion's kit. And she's like a high B, low A tier option. If you have the setup and the tools around her, she can actually be a really good mid laner, and it's definitely underrated to a degree here. Aurora kind of sits like in as like a high B tier, low A tier option as well. She did get nerfed this patch, and it definitely did have a bit of an impact on her. Obviously, her ultimate is a very powerful ability, and tagging the amount of damage that does can hurt her quite aggressively. But with the champion being relatively new, she should gain over the patch, and it should even back out to being like an A tier pick. And then if she stays in the state, she could definitely rise back up towards like maybe even an S tier. But I imagine people will learn how to play around her ultimate a bit better, and then learn like her Q range, and like trying to avoid some of her skills, and like knowing how to play around her invis. Stuff like this can obviously be played around, and I imagine her win rate should probably like sit around like a 50% mark if she ends up being like in a relatively balanced spot. Syndra. So Syndra definitely has gained a bit more recently with the ult buff. Actually did a surprisingly large amount to help her. Like finding more burst angles can be really valuable. It's and like solidifying a snowball advantage. Stuff like that can be really big on this champion. She definitely rises back up from like the B tier to the A tier, and I believe Syndra's to be in a pretty solid spot at the moment. If you land her skills, she can be very powerful within the game. So definitely look for those angles where you're in a strong matchup and you can really utilize the full advantage of your kit. Moving up, we have 3 champions. So we have Vladimir, who I believe is kind of slept on at the moment. I know a lot of people rushing Cosmic Drive on him, but Rabadon's looks to be very successful in its current state. You can obviously like opt into Rabadon Cosmic or Cosmic Rabadon, but the Rabadon Cosmic does look to be his strongest core pairing. And I know Elite 500, I believe, has been encouraging some like Grasp W Max variations. I don't know how legit that is. I haven't really dug into it enough, but it might be something worth looking into. The champion's definitely doing a bit better though at the moment. Can definitely rise up to like a high A tier position in his current state. Wei, I agree. Should probably be in the A tier. I was talking to a lot of people in the comment section of the last one about like where the strengths and weaknesses of Wei lie. He's obviously a pretty difficult champion to pick up, and having like 9 different abilities can be quite the hurdle to get over. That being said, he does do a lot of damage. He has great tools within his kit. He definitely spikes within mid-game, where like you have access to like 2-3 items in situations, and can be quite valuable late, but he can be overwhelmed, and yeah, obviously the difficulty of the pick can definitely be quite taxing, and I have him as like a low A tier, high B tier pick at the moment, but yeah, there's definitely value to this champion. In fact, if you want to watch someone play Hui at the moment, Raynor, who is StarCraft 2 pro player, I believe, is working with LS, trying to learn how to play mid lane. He is doing in-houses at the moment, and I am one of the top laners there, so if you ever tune into LS's stream, I might just be there. I played with Trimby earlier this morning, which was great fun. I'm usually playing my Argot, that is where you'll see me, and yeah, definitely tune in. Could definitely learn a thing or two from LS's coaching. That could definitely be quite valuable. Anyway, I digress. Hui, yeah, probably deserves to be in like an A tier spot at the moment. Lissandra is also going to move up alongside Talia. So in Talia's case, she's doing a bit better. I think that's just how I describe it. Like, she got nerfed, and her nerfs obviously dropped her down to the B tier, but then like meta shifts and like popularity swings have kind of pushed her back up to being like a low A tier option. Obviously, there's lots of value to this champion's kit, but it can, if you ever fall behind, it can feel quite slow, and your damage can just not really be there in situations, especially if you're having to play far out of the fight and you're not able to consistently land your WE combo. Lissandra has had a great glow up this patch. The Q buff combined with the Arsenal buff have really done quite a bit for her, and she definitely sits as like a high A tier option now. I would really recommend playing Lissandra into matchups where she's really powerful in, like where you can like really heavily shut down the opponent with your ult and your W. Definitely in a powerful spot at the moment, very deserving of a high A tier position. Renekton, definitely a champion which is kind of slept on in the mid lane. I primarily would recommend him as like an answer to Yasuo Yone blind. This pick can completely shut them down with that W, and his like just raw damage output can be quite powerful in those situations. If you're blinding him, he loses a lot of value, but you can opt into Stride Breaker into some of those ranged matchups. You can opt into like Marks if you're struggling to AP. Tabai can be something you opt into obviously like AD poke, AD auto attack based matchups, and there's definitely value to this champion at the moment. But I have a couple of other juggernauts from the top lane down to the mid lane, which I would encourage a bit more over Renekton, but Renekton primarily in those Yasuo Yone matchup scenarios. Vex, also great in those scenarios as well. If you're looking for something AP with great anti-dash mechanics, then Vex should be your go-to champion. She snowballs really aggressively. She doesn't scale particularly well, but yeah, if you can play around her incredible mid-game where she can do a lot of damage and snowball really aggressively, then yeah, you should find a decent amount of success on this pick. Zac is not here because I've taken him back off the tier list again. He's unpopular. I mainly just wanted to speak about him last patch as still being like a solid, like a low S, high A tier option. But he's very unpopular within the mid lane. But he's a solid AP tank option if you are looking for one. Victor. I think Victor's underrated. I really do. I actually played this champion like a couple hours ago, and he still does a lot of damage, and you can still get a lot of value out of a pick like this. He does tend to be pretty slow, which is like the common concern with a champion like Victor, that if you're not getting your stacks early, you're getting pressured off the wave, you're getting overwhelmed, then it can be quite hard to really ever find traction on this pick in the game. But if you ever get like 1 or 2 kills, you get an early augment on E, and then getting either on W or Q for your secondary one, then this champion can be really valuable. You have 2 different build options. You have the Ludens, Lichbane, Burst variations. You have the Blackfire and the Andrew variations. You have different rune choices in the Phase Rush, the Summonary, the Comet I've even seen, and then the First Strike is like your 4 core keystone options. But you have more than that. Like Victor actually has a lot of rune choices open to him, and yeah, I think this champion's kind of underrated, but he is like a lower A tier pick at the moment. Vel'Koz, also over my A tier. Solid artillery mage, has good upfront damage. Obviously doesn't scale as aggressively with items as some of the other champions on this list, but if you're able to get an advantage, getting burst on this pick can feel really oppressive for the enemy, and yeah, he can definitely snowball quite aggressively, especially if your ult is really valuable within that game. Pantheon. Solid A tier pick. Kind of akin to Renekton, honestly. Both these champions great at shutting down the likes of Yasuo and Yone. Their upfront burst damage combined with their point-and-click CC can be really valuable. Obviously, Pantheon has a bit more map roaming capability, which can make him a bit more valuable in the mid lane. But Renekton, as an upfront bruiser, definitely has the advantage there. Pantheon can opt into bruiser items with his like health ratios now and still be really valuable, but there's definitely a lot more power there. But I'd put these two around similar points on the mid lane tier list at the moment. Echo is being separated from Diana. I'm going to move Diana back up to the S tier. I think this champion is still an incredibly strong early game bully, and I believe that Echo is slightly weaker in that space and can be a bit harder to pilot. Obviously, Halo Blades and like Scorch with E-Start is still something people opt into on this champion, and it can definitely give you an advantage. But yeah, he can definitely be a bit harder to pilot and a bit easier to shut down if you if he doesn't have those kills to like really force and then ult backwards to like have that safety net. But there is still definitely a lot of power to this pick. He is also pretty heavily played by OTPs, and yeah, is still a solid jungle flex. Other champions here, so we have Swain and Cassiopeia, which are like the high A+, low S tier picks, so just a bit more situational, but these two champions still can be incredibly valuable in the spots where they are able to get like full use of their kit. In Swain's case, if you're able to stick to the target, this pick can be incredibly valuable into like short range compositions. Cassiopeia, if you're able to consistently land ultimate and then utilize your kiting capability combined with your miasma, also can be really valuable within the game, but just not quite S+ picks in my opinion. I'm actually going to drag some picks down, so we're going to have Malzahar and Annie as like the two easier picks which I'm dragging down. I just don't think these champions are as warranted S tier picks anymore. Obviously, their simplicity still gives them a lot of value, but they're not as strong as some of the other picks, which like do just have like raw kits which are better at the moment, arguably. Like Annie, of course, with her CC and upfront damage can be really powerful, and like Tibbers can be built as a raid boss, and like you can play around that to a degree. In Malzahar's case, people are still going Malignance on this pick a bit too much compared to Blackfire Torch, which has been like outperforming it for a while. Obviously, the idea of Malzahar is you want to play around his ultimate, having it up more often can be valuable, but the Blackfire Torch is incredibly powerful in this pick, as you can like oftentimes have it spread to multiple targets on the enemy team, combined with the build path being quite powerful. Obviously relatively similar to Malignance, but the Barn also really benefits him, like tagging minions and then utilizing that to spread to more can also be quite valuable. And overall, yeah, Malzahar drops from the S tier to the A tier, but he's still a very valuable, easy pick, which is great for shutting down hyper carries. Other champions which I'm bringing down are going to be Kennen. Actually, Kennen's just been removed. I haven't added him back because the pick is no longer really being played that much in mid lane, but he does drop down to the A tier if I was to include him. The other champion is Silas. Okay. Do I want to drop Silas down? I think, okay, so Silas has two build variations, which are really powerful at the moment if you pick the right one in the correct game. Lichbane, Shadowflame Silas, great as like a burst build. Roa into Protobelt, or Roa into Cosmic, also really valuable if you pick it in the right game. This champion is a bit more dependent on picking those builds in the right spots. If you pick the wrong one and you're like either too squishy and you're not really able to get your burst down, or you're not really doing enough damage to be the carry within the game, it can feel quite punishing. He's a bit more situational. You want to use him as a pick into primarily champions with strong ultimates, and you can really benefit from that. So I think he should probably sit up as like a high A tier pick, but if you're proficient at him, you're itemizing him correctly, he can definitely sit in the S tier. He can be incredibly valuable in those situations. And then I have my S tier champions here. So I'm going to lead with Veigar, who is probably one of the weaker options here at the moment. He's still a strong itemization in like Varroa, the Ludens, and then some of the movement speed options. Rabadon's, of course, being a really valuable item on him. He scales quite aggressive. He scales incredibly aggressively with his infinitely scaling AP, combined with the ratio scaling on his ability maxes, and it really solidifies him as like a low elo S tier pick. The higher up you go, the more often you'll get punished, counterpick, and it can be quite hard to pilot this champion. But his damage is undisputedly high. Yeah, this pick still has a lot of value as like a low S tier option. Brand should be in my A tier. I think I've forgotten. No, Brand is in my S tier. Never mind. I have Brand in my S tier because he's really easy to play, and his damage over time is some of the best in the game, which like solidifies him here as like an S tier option. Obviously, the nerfs to him in the jungle do affect him in the mid lane, as he's not able to poach camps as easily, so he also sits towards the low end of the S tier. Heimerdinger also sits here. So Heimerdinger mid, very unpopular, but is very powerful. Obviously, you might see it on one in like the entire split, or maybe not even. Like you might see one a year if you play the game a decent amount. But this champion has good itemization. I spoke about him in the top lane tier list. And yeah, his itemization combined with the power of his damage, the durability of his turrets if you have a lot of AP. Like Rabadon's Rush is not a troll option on Heimerdinger just because of the scalers on his turret being like really pushed towards like getting a lot of AP early on into the game. And yeah, Heimerdinger isn't a great spot at the moment. I really do think this champion's a good S tier pick, and if you want to learn Heimerdinger, then that's definitely something you can find a lot of success on at the moment. Aesol moves up to the S tier. This champion still incredibly aggressively scales. His damage is absurd. If you're able to, if you go Q, W, E max as like the core thing you do, then he's incredibly powerful off that. Obviously, his early game can be quite punishing. If you're not getting your items early, whether that's like your Blackfires, your Rylai's, your Leandri, stuff like that, then yeah, this champion can be a bit slow to come online. But once he comes online, once you get like your first big ultimate, this champion can be incredibly impressive in the game, and yeah, can be incredibly valuable to most team compositions. Diana, I spoke about, moves up to the S tier. Very strong early game pick. She is one of the strongest early game AP champions in the game at the moment. I've said game like 3 times within one sentence. But yeah, this champion, incredibly impressive early on, with the likes of Electrocute, Scorch, just throwing Qs at the target and then like looking for those kill angles, getting the E down and then just blowing them up. The ultimate can feel quite lackluster. I do think Diana probably needs a bit of a reshape to give some power to her ultimate and maybe take some of that power away from her kit, as her ultimate should be one of those big showstopper moments. But Diana, very solid S tier pick at the moment. Quinn, also my S tier, bit more gimmicky, but the roam potential of this champion combined with the build of the Electrocute, Profane Hydra, Symbiotic Souls, incredibly impressive. It has so much control over the map. Her push power is really good, obviously when you have access to that Profane Hydra. Using it combined with the AoE on the autos, very powerful. And yeah, she's a very deserving S tier champion in the mid lane at the moment. Nasus has finally gained the popularity he deserves. He's being nerfed in 14.18 because of how powerful he is, which is really funny to me. But yeah, Nasus finally getting the recognition. His 4-point E build variations are incredibly oppressive to lane against. It, like when you're running Summon Ares, Scorch, and you are slamming E's down, it can be very hard for almost any laner to like really stand up to that. You can then obviously opt into like Qmax variations. I mean, standard would be something like a 3-4 point E with Summon Ares, and then yeah, you Qmax, Wmax, fill out the last points on E. You're going like your Trinity or your Iceborne. Well, maybe not so much Iceborne. We've seen it a bit, but it's not something I'd recommend defaulting on unless you're into primarily AD matchups. And then Frozen Heart, Spirits, stuff like that can be quite nice on him. He doesn't infinitely, well, I mean, he technically does infinitely scale, but this champion is primarily playing around his mid game. He does not scale that well later on unless you go like hour plus into the game, for example, but that's basically non-existent. Play around his strong mid game. You should be really powerful within the game, get a lot of free wins before he is nerfed in 14.18. Obviously the matchups are a bit more situational, but you can oftentimes itemize accordingly or rune and build order accordingly. Set, underrated mid lane pick at the moment. I know a lot of people are discouraged by Set as being like this pick which can be abused early on to the game, can be kited, but then we've obviously seen Garen, we've seen Nasus, and it's not quite as like he doesn't quite have the same tools as them, but he still has relatively similar like catching tools. The Q is a movement speed increase, the E is decently ranged, and his R can drag people all the way back to turret. He does a lot of damage. He's a bit more early game or early mid game skewed. His team fighting and late game are still valuable though. Like if you get a good W later on to the game, it can decide entire fights. Obviously it's a bit harder to hit against better players and they will play around it a bit more, but Seb is a really slept on mid lane pick at the moment. Garen is obviously the other pick to Nasus, which we've seen in competitive, and Garen I would say is stronger in the mid lane at the moment. Like Garen has been a pick which I've had in my S tier for the longest amount of time, as this pick is very strong when it gets like 1-2 items, but whether that's like a Stride Breaker, a PD, and then like you're going things like Deadman, Steric, IE, Mortal Reminder, you have options there for you, and yeah, he's in a really good spot at the moment, a great mid lane champion. And top lane champion. Like Garen is good in both roles at the moment, so definitely play him where you can. Lux sits as like a mid S tier option, very simple to play, very good wave clear, very good burst damage. If you fall behind, you'll feel it, but if you're ahead of the curve, you can one-shot most targets in the game without magic resist. So Lux, very solid S tier pick. Xerath, a great artillery mage at the moment. If you snowball on this champion, it can be very hard for the enemy team to answer. Obviously, if you can overwhelm Xerath and get on him, he can definitely be a bit more punishing to play. But yeah, if you're positioning correctly, your damage is really high. Your ultimate is an incredibly powerful tool now that they've buffed it so aggressively with that with having like more than 3 shots, which it used to have in the past. And yeah, Xerath, really solid S tier pick. 3 more champions here. So we have Anivia, which is in a really good spot at the moment. Her itemization, also really good. The Roa, the Archangel, the just like the raw AP she can opt into. Things like Rabadon, Zonya, Banshee, and then things like Crypt Bloom, Void can wrap up the build. Overall, yeah, Anivia just has a lot of solid itemization. She has loads of control over lane and objective fighting. Her mid game is incredibly strong. Her early game is really strong. Well, early game, once you hit 6, is usually pretty strong. Before that, you can struggle in certain matchups. Her late game isn't as good as a lot of people think it is, but you oftentimes dominate so much within the mid game that you can convert into late game advantages where you can feel quite oppressive for a while. And yeah, Anivia, probably the highest S tier option I have at the moment alongside Garen here. And then my 2 S plus picks, the same as I had last patch. Naafiri, obviously to a degree surprises some people, but then won't surprise others. She is the easiest to play AD assassin in the game. She is very point and click, stat checky. She scales really aggressively. She is a great go-to AD mid laner at the moment, and something I'd really recommend playing if you're like in one of those lower ranks and you just want to get some LP and then like go through the ranks. In Galio's case, he's a great AP tank option, can be really valuable within a lot of team comps. His itemization, obviously you have the Lichbane variation and you have the Hollow Radiance variation, which are both really strong at the moment. And yeah, they make for 2 really good staple S plus picks at the moment. If you want something a bit more AP, Galio's great for that. If you want something with a bit more AD, Naafiri's great for that. But there are lots of good S tier options in the mid lane at the moment, which all have different purposes and utility options accessible to them. Overall, mid lane is in a pretty healthy spot compared to where it was at the beginning of this split. Obviously, the beginning of this split was very much dominated by the marksmen, the Corkis, the Zeris, the Lucians, the Tristanas. All that kind of jazz has definitely faded out. The pick rate's gone down. Their win rates have like massively been deflated and are in really rough spots at the moment. And yeah, the mid lane looks to be in a pretty healthy spot. So thank you guys for watching. I'll see you in the next one. Goodbye.